Hello everyone and welcome back. Recently I was commissioned to do the sewing parts and the breastplate for a character by the name of Hulkenberg from a game called Metaphor ReFantazio. Now, depending on when you're watching this video, this game might have come out a long time ago or it might have just recently come out as well. And of course, if you're new here, there's a link to my website down below if you want to get familiar with the kind of work that I do. Now, like I said, the sewing and the breastplate. So we're going to be working on the breastplate, the bodysuit, and the cape. Before we get into it though, let's talk a little bit about proportions. Proportions is a pretty important thing when it comes to cosplay, as most of the time our references come from video games or comic books or other forms of media like that that aren't necessarily already live action. And we're trying to translate those things into live action to wear them ourselves. Now that being said, sometimes, most of the time, characters' proportions are not at all our proportions, i.e. Dark Souls heads. Now in this situation, let's just go ahead and line up Hulkenberg with my very cursed T-pose body. Now I have this specifically to double check proportions when it comes to making my costumes. And also it kind of works as a good rule of thumb when it comes to clients as well, even though I do have their measurements. So let's just go ahead and make my body the proportion of Hulkenberg, just for fun. You see how that gets a little bit cursed as you go on. It looks perfectly fine in the game and in the concept arts and all of that, but when it comes to putting it on a person, a real life person, that tends to change, especially with all of our different body types. So we're going to be changing some of the proportions for the character just to make it make sense in real life. So it's not going to be an exact perfect replica for the actual reference image, but it's going to be the character. It's just going to make sense in a real life setting. Now enough of my rambling. Let's get to building. Me! I'm the sponsor. Are you making this cosplay? I have patterns of these patterns. If you visit my website, you'll find a link to my Ko-fi shop where you'll find these patterns, and they can be quite versatile for other cosplays as well, especially the bodysuit. I suppose the cape can be relatively versatile as well, and the breastplate, usually pretty versatile. Of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Links down in the description. Thank you. This has been a sponsor by myself. The fabric I'll be using is a navy blue 4-way stretch. It isn't lycra, but it also isn't scuba knit. The pattern pieces you're seeing here are master copies of the ones available on my website. For the cuffs, I am using lycra, but first some iron-on interfacing. This one has a little bit of stretch, so it'll work out perfectly. Once everything is cut out, the assembly line may begin. The sleeves will get seamed up on the sides, and so will the center fronts to the side fronts. I'm laying them out like this so you can see the best way to visualize the opposing curves. Then I just flip one over and begin clamping. Now, the curve is the fun part, but honestly, these aren't too bad. I start by lining up the edge and then working my way inside. Pins work best for this part. You can also clip into the seam allowance a little bit less than ½ inch. And of course, the same thing for the center back and side back pieces. When you go to sew pieces like this that naturally go against each other, you really have to babysit every stitch to make sure nothing is bunching up underneath. And of course, this is a stretch fabric, so a zigzag stitch is what I'm using. Stretch stitches also work, but I'm used to zigzag. Good thing to keep in mind that zigzag stitches will make the 5/8 of an inch line no longer accurate on your stitch plate unless you can move your needle like I can. I always opt for cleanliness, so even though this won't fray at all, I'm overlocking the edges. By the way, if you do not have an overlock machine, fear not. There's a pretty cool video by Talk Custom here on YouTube, I can link it down below, where he shows you how to overlock things without an overlock machine, and I actually do use that technique sometimes, even though I do have the machine. Anyways, now the seam allowance can be ironed outwards. This fabric's a little bit stubborn, but that's okay. I just ironed it on both sides. It's ironed to the outside because otherwise it would bunch up in this little curve area. And now I can sew it down. I'm actually not using a zigzag stitch for this part because the pattern doesn't need to stretch vertically. So if you wanted to, you wouldn't even need to have used a zigzag stitch on the center seam, but it's safer if ever the top stitch breaks, which it shouldn't. And now the back can be seamed up. Ignore the fact that we need a zipper. I'm using a zigzag stitch up until around the area in which the zipper will be. Then I'm switching to the straight stitch with extra length. I'm overlocking the seam allowance separately. I could have done it before seaming it, but sometimes that causes the fabric to misalign. This looks like a time skip, but the shoulder seams actually do need to be seamed up before continuing. And that's because the collar needs to be added on before the zipper. And I guess, while I'm at it, I might as well make the fake pocket flaps too. They just get pillowcase lined and the collar folded and seamed on the sides, turned inside out, trimmed, the corners poked out, the open edge shoved inward. Please, it's, I hand sewed it. These flaps are pinned in place and then sewn on. And for this, I use a straight stitch with a slight zag to it since it's closer to the hips where it might be subject to some stretch. Anyway, the collar is added to the neck hole. And now I can pin the zipper. I'm a little nuts, so I pinned it to the underside and then switched it to the top side. I just really wanted to stay nice and centered on the seam allowance. So I can switch to my zipper foot and sew the zipper on. Seam rip the center, get the little threads out of there, and then have a working zipper. Now you might notice that these side seams are not connected yet, and that's because other than the zipper, there's still things that need to be done on the rest of the bodysuit before I can connect those up. Things like these rivet details. Since the fabric stretches, I'm only poking a hole with the awl, so they never need to stretch out of their spot. And now, the side seams can be done. Ooh, check that out. Okay, enough of that. There are ankle holes to be hemmed. First, they were overlocked, folded inwards, and now they're being sewn with a zigzag stitch. Sleeve time. That also gets overlocked after it's stitched up. So before I was done making this pattern, I didn't have the neckline fully patterned out, so for me, I had to trace this out with chalk, do some measurements, and cut it. And of course, more overlock and a bajillion clamps.
The clamps!
And now stitching. It isn't folded over by much, maybe about ½ an inch. Remember the cuffs from earlier? Now the threads get switched to white and the cuffs get folded in half and sewn. And then they get sewn to the wrist hole. Black threads underneath and white on top. This way I can stitch in the ditch and it'll barely show on both sides. Just missing the buttons now. Cape. To start with the cape, we need an inner structure for the shoulders. You can use buckram, foam, whatever you want. You can even go the 80s route if you'd like, but I'm using foam. After cutting them out, the borders are glued to the top and then the edges are rounded just in case they'd show through the fabric. You don't have to though, it actually won't show with the proper weight fabric. Speaking of fabric, I'm using a heavyweight satin and tracing the registration marks with heat erase pen. Note that it's good to test out your heat erase pens on your fabric because sometimes they don't erase. Very rare though. There was a lot of stuff to mark off and transfer from the pattern. All of it is important though. These markings let you know where to sew when it's not next to an edge, where to line things up, and where to sew in a curve. Chalk works too. Before proceeding though, there's something missing. These things. So it's time to bust out the embroidery hoops and stabilizer. Line everything up and let it do its thing. The stabilizer is cut away and the pieces ironed. The lining gets some stabilizer for the clover bits, and now the front and backs can be seamed together. For the tops of the shoulder, the outer registration marks align with the side seam. And again, clipping into the seam allowance will help place the fabric around the curve. Once that's done, now everything can be lined up with the lining. And here's where those little lines come in handy. It all gets trimmed, corners clipped, and then turned inside out. So, here's something fun. I accidentally did 5/8 of an inch seam allowance instead of 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I already trimmed everything. The cape is too small. Yeah. Yep, I had to start over and make a whole new one. The next step would be to iron everything now and top stitch the edge. And again, the thread in the bobbin is a light gray and the one on top is black. Now, I need this emblem thing on one side of the cape. I need to digitize it though, so finding the proper flat image is a must. I ended up finding this, so that's good. And then this guy for a more flat color reference, even though his is inverted. His name is Louis. If you guys want the file, I can put it up on my website, just let me know in the comments. Anyways, all of that negative space is peeled off, it's stuck to the side and ironed, and the plastic is peeled away. I want to make it a little bit less crisp so that it has a semi-worn look like it does in the reference, so I watered down some black acrylic. Now onto the collar. This could have been done sooner, by the way, I just hadn't patterned it yet. Half the collar gets some interfacing, and then the other half gets the lower edge ironed up by about 1/2 inch. The two halves are seamed together, turned inside out, and ironed. I kind of went over this in the Ghoul video in an MS Paint diagram, but here it is again with footage. The non-folded half is seamed to the cape, and then the fold half is placed over the seam allowance and hand-stitched down. And now it's done, once the structure bits are connected. I'm using Gutermann fabric glue. The front closures are hooks and eyes, by the way. And only one thing left. The breastplate. It's not what it looks like! This is tinfoil on a fiberglass mannequin. It's going to bend and fold into the shapes needed for the breastplate. We need it to not rip and move, so duct tape. The shape is drawn on and then it can be cut out. Of course, there's a little bit more to it than that, like figuring out the cut angles and the registration marks, darts in the cup, etc. But for the most part, it's all 90-degree cuts so far, except for the rounded parts on the main piece. These start out at 90 degrees and quickly taper to a 45-degree outwards and back to 90 degrees at the end. The center of the main front piece has a bit of an angle in it, so I'm just going to mark that off and sharpen my blade. Cut a bevel that doesn't go all the way through like I did right here, or you'll have to cut a new piece. Whoops. Ever have a hard time putting contact cement on foam darts? I just aggressively bend them out of the way from each other like this and apply the glue. This right here is a brand new front piece with a proper bevel, and I can glue that shut. And here's the result. Pretty cool, right? It works in curves too, and the other way around. Now the great thing about foam is its stretchability. A bit of heat on both sides, and you can shape it and let it cool off in the right shape. And now it can be glued onto the front. Glue things very carefully and slowly if need be. Less cleanup makes for a cleaner product. And sometimes we think we can clean something up and we really can't. Also, for anybody wondering, this is my sanding station setup. Not the most pleasant, but I've had worse. Way worse. Anyways, I'm in here because the edges need to be rounded and the seams need a quick pass with the sanding drum followed by the stone bit. Another quick pass with the kitchen blowtorch and all of those fuzzies are sealed away and minimized. You can use a lighter or a heat gun too. Time to move on to the details. As mentioned in the intro, some proportion changes are necessary so the breastplate will only have 3 of these raised tiers rather than 4. The little junctions here are just to prevent the pattern from flopping everywhere. 2mm foam for the detail bits. Also worth mentioning that the center seam edges of the pieces here are cut at a slight inward angle. I'm sorry about the top of my head, I really have no solution. Super glue for these little circle bits.
Careful, SpongeBob! Careful, SpongeBob! Careful, SpongeBob!
Still missing the edge pieces. This is the piece that'll have to have an outward angle cut into it. That way, when it's matched with a 90-degree angle, it'll stick out. The back piece got all of the same steps, but it didn't really want to hold its shape, so I'm gluing in some brackets to help it hold. Quick seal time. It really looks like I'm using a lot, but I'm just smoothing it out with water and spreading it outwards to make sure it's tapered. The breastplate has some dangly straps with triangle buckles, so for this I'm using a 3 stack of Warbler. It takes a while to heat and cut, but eventually, with patience, it'll be cut out. A bit more cleanup, and then it's covered in spackle. Of course, these can also be made out of foam. While things are drying, the straps need a little wraparound bits, so I'm burning away the fuzz on the edges. A little hot glue, and it's set aside. Quickseal can be sanded, by the way, just very, very lightly and nothing rougher than 220 grit. The spackle, however, go nuts. Now, off screen, the foam stuff was primed with about 3 layers of Plastidip, and the Warbler stuff was primed with some automotive filler primer, sanded a few times in between, not the Plastidip, the filler primer, and base coated. The Warbler stuff was base coated in a black enamel, but honestly you could use whatever you want, you can hand paint it, whatever. Oh, and the breastplate wasn't just left Plastidip, I also base coated that with a spray paint that has some flex to it. Some people hate silver paint that isn't opaque in one go. I love it for stuff like this. I like the effect it gives to just dry brush it on. It has some dimension and doesn't look too plastic, if that makes sense. Although sometimes opacity is what you want. While that stuff gets sealed, let's shade the strap parts a little bit with some black Angelus acrylic paint. And now we can connect this tiny bit that was done off camera to, oops, good catch there with the direction. We'll get back to this in a second. For now, let's punch holes, heat up this Warbler rolly, and start making our fake buckle. The attachments for this to be wearable need to properly adhere to the foam, so scoring it and heating it open gives a great grip for hot glue. But first, let's cover these ruffle pieces. One very long one for the neckline and one larger one for the neck ruffle. The big one is folded and pillowcase lined. Then it's gathered up, folded over a little bit so that the excess strings wrap around. Also, as you saw, I had sewn a clip onto the back. The neckline ruffle is technically supposed to be on the bodysuit, but I want to be sure it'll always be perfectly visible, so that's why it got connected to the breastplate itself. I think it looks pretty cute. And the aforementioned hot glue with the Velcro and stuff. Also, you might notice where I cut into the faux leather a bit here where it was going to be glued, just being safe. And time to put it all together. I think it's pretty cool. I really like the character design, and I really look forward to seeing it with the rest of the pieces being commissioned from other people. Thank you so much for watching, and again, if you're interested in the patterns for this costume, the links are going to be down below in the description on my Ko-fi shop. If for some reason you're watching this in the future and my Ko-fi shop no longer exists, it'll be linked somewhere on my website. I do stream on Twitch, so if you're interested in watching these projects get made live, you can come hang out on Twitch and chat with us and all of that good stuff. There's also a link down below to the Discord. If you're into the whole Discord thing and you want to share some of the stuff that you've been working on, we've got a section for that. And of course, as always, I would like to take a moment to thank my Twitch subscribers. Without you guys, I wouldn't be able to do this. Now, I am slowly making my way through the backlog of stuff that I need to edit, so some of my footage is going to be old footage from the old cameras I used to use in the future. Listen, guys, I'm working so hard to try to get this backlog done. It just takes... It's a lot of work doing videos. It's a lot of work. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. I appreciate you guys hanging out, and I appreciate you guys watching. So until next time, guys, I'm not too sure which video I'm going to be working on next. Like I said, there's a bunch of backlog, so I'll see you guys then.